Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a Grammy Award-winning conductor who hails from the United States. Over a long and distinguished career, he has guest conducted all over the world, and was music director of the Brooklyn Philharmonic for 8 years and the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra for 20 years. He starts as music director of the Fort Worth Symphony in 2022, whilst continuing to teach at the Aspen Music Festival, a post he's held since 2011. In a change from the norm, today's interview will start from the moment I pressed record and started chatting. I think it sets the tone for how the rest of the interview went, with us laughing and chuckling throughout, and it was definitely one of my personal favourite interviews so far. It gives me a very great pleasure to welcome Robert Spano. How do you pronounce your... I want the definitive version. Are you Spano or Spano?
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. And do you prefer to be called Robert, or what do people most people call you? Because most people call me Mike. So
I get Bob, and okay. I'm Robert, and equally good as Spano and Spano.
Fine. Well, I may well drift between Robert and Bob and see how we get on. Right,
That's
here we
good.
go. I shall start. Robert, it's lovely to see you again after many years, because I remember playing for you fondly, very much, when you used to come to Birmingham. How are you?
Good to see you.
We have a lot to get through because I've done my homework, as the listeners know, and I want to go right back to the beginning. I know that your instruments listed are piano, flute, and violin, but also that you composed. Musical family, or did it come out of nowhere? How did music first enter your life?
Oh, musical family, yeah.
Yeah.
Family business.
Right.
It was my grandparents, uncles, certainly my parents, and it was just in the house, in the family.
Yeah.
Very natural thing to study music.
But with some of the conductors who come from musical families, it was sort of expected of them to go into music. You know, it was the family trade. Yeah. Did you have any pressure or not, or did it just happen naturally?
Well, I'm told, I don't remember this because my childhood memories don't go past, I don't know, 8 or something like that backwards. Yeah. But I'm told that my older brother had started taking piano lessons at my parents' insistence when he was 5. Yeah. And because he wasn't enjoying it, they weren't about to push me into it. But I insisted that I get lessons for myself when I was 6.
Yeah.
So there was certainly some innate interest on my part as well, because I'm told that I was the one who said, no, I really want the lessons. I don't care if he doesn't want them.
And so you start on piano, but how quickly did the flute and the violin appear?
Well, flute came maybe when I was 8 or 9. Yeah. And my father was making flutes at the time for Gemeinhardt Flute Company. And so I was handed a flute. You're going to play this now. And I do remember this very well, that after about a year of playing the flute, which I loved and continued to play until I was in college, I wanted to play the violin very badly. And they were reluctant for me to take on another instrument. But again, I was a stubborn child and I insisted that I play the violin as well. So I started the violin a year later.
Yeah. And at any point, or at what point, because I'm sure at some point it happened, and I'm assuming it was on the flute, did you join youth orchestras or bands or local bands?
Yeah, I think it was 7th grade. So I'm trying to think how old I would have been at the time, but I went to next to where I grew up in Elkhart, Indiana, is South Bend, Indiana. And there was a youth orchestra in South Bend at that time that was not for high school students, but for junior high school students. So there was only the 3 years before high school, the kids that were in that. So for 2 years, I played the flute in that orchestra. And then my last year, I played the violin.
Yeah. And it's always where we normally, where we would meet our first conductors. Were you like me? I mean, I seem to remember thinking all the way back when I first joined a proper youth orchestra when I was 12 or 13, looking at this person at the front, and it was always, well, actually, no, it was a lie. The first person who conducted me was a woman, dear Angela Warner and Helen of the senior strings at Medway, but usually it was a guy. I was looking at them thinking, why are you doing that? What are you doing that for? I wasn't just blindly following. Were you like that as well?
Yeah. And my first influential conductor was a woman as well. Because my violin teacher was the high school orchestra conductor.
Right.
And then she also ran the orchestra in the junior high school that I went to. And she was a very dynamic, charismatic person. And so there were a group of us who she was the Pied Piper kind of thing.
Yeah.
And she actually gave me my first conducting lesson later when I was 14. So she had a big influence in that way.
I'm assuming it was a conducting lesson before you conducted your own piece. I read this off Wikipedia, which can't always be trusted, but it looks like it can in this case. So you conducted your own piece, or what was the orchestra or the orchestration?
Oh, it was a standard sort of double winds brass orchestra. And because I had to conduct this piece and had no idea what I was going to do, I went to her and said, can you teach me the basics? So she taught me the basic beat patterns. And that's basically all I knew. And so when you're 14, it's easy not to be intimidated and afraid. At least that's my memory of it. So I was very excited to do this, had no idea that I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And then, so what a great experience to have, listening to this orchestra play my music while I'm standing there. And I vividly remember finishing a reading through the piece and saying, wow, thank you, that's so great. And the conductor of that orchestra said to me, would you like to rehearse? I said, why?
Oh, wonderful.
It was great, yeah.
When you look
that's
back,
when I got the bug.
Well, that was going to be my next question, which when you look back, was that the moment you got the bug? And you just said it was. I remember leading it wasn't my county youth orchestra, it was my local youth orchestra in the Medway Towns in Kent. The conductor once said to me, I'd like to go and listen. You're leading the orchestra. Why don't you lead and conduct from the violin? And I think probably looking back, it was the Freischütz Overture. I conducted the whole thing from the first violinist chair, But I think probably looking back, that was probably the first time. And then I conducted a piece of my own, very similar to you, but age 18.
And so that was that moment for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Looking back,
yeah.
But then I did nothing about it until much later. Did you do something about it?
Oh, not too much later. Maybe when I was 17, I formed a string orchestra of my friends, and I started taking lessons from I had gone to we had all state orchestras in those days. I think they still exist. And I went to be part of that. And the conductor of that was the associate conductor of the Indianapolis Symphony at that time. I was smoking because I was a bad high school student. And
you and me both.
And he smoked. Right. And so all the breaks, I could talk to him that we took in those rehearsals. And finally, after those few days of doing this all-state orchestra experience, I said to him, do you teach conducting? And he said, no. And I said, do you want to start? and he said, let me think about it. But we stayed in touch. And then I had a lesson with him maybe once a month for a year. And he was so generous with his time. I mean, the lesson would be 3 or 4 hours. And then we would go to an Indianapolis Symphony concert together, and we would analyze what was going on with the conductor and with the orchestra. It was just a wonderful foundation he gave me. We used Max Rudolph's book, A Grammar of Conducting, he was later my teacher. And so there was also something beautiful for me in my life that little circle got closed. But that book for me was foundational in my training. And I still think that the principles in it he's right to call it the grammar of conducting in my mind.
Yeah, I think it's on the shelf behind me somewhere. Most of these books, I've bought Gustav Meyer's book, and I'm now into a professional career. You still find these things very, very interesting. What was the name of the first guy who used to give you those 3 or 4 hour lessons?
Paul Polivnik.
Right. Yeah. What a wonderful education, especially then to go to a concert and
that was great. That was just great. And so when I was taking those lessons with him, I formed a string orchestra of my friends, and we'd give concerts at a church or the library and that kind of thing.
And well, you mentioned Max Rudolph being when you went to Curtis. In between, you went to now I don't know whether I'm going to pronounce this right, the Oberlin Conservatory, and studied with Robert Baustian or Borstian, or Baustian.
Yeah.
With these three main teachers, did they all sort of sing off the same hymn sheet? Were they very much into the technique of things, less about score study, or was it, half and half?
Oh, it was, in every case, it was a lot about score study.
Right.
So it just, despite Rudolph's reputation for the mechanics of that book, I mean, certainly he was coming out, he was a good friend of Zell's. And so there was a real kind of gigantic intellect at work there that leaked into understanding of scores and expanding one's cultural awareness beyond the score, and in-depth kind of interest in the composer and the soil from which that music came. So that was all wonderful. And especially in working with Baustian at Oberlin, he was probably the most influential teacher on me, because I worked with him most time-wise. And he was going to retire when I started studying with him. So he made a point and he left before I finished a degree in that program with him. So he made a point of spending a lot of time with me. I was seeing him maybe 3 times a week. And lessons were often, we're going to do dictation today. And he would sit down and start playing things that I was meant to write down, often quite complex and 3-4 voices. Yeah. And, or a lesson would be, here's a Mahler symphony, play. So that was terrific.
Yeah.
And to study with him, I had put myself through quite rigorous score playing exercises at the keyboard and solfege and all that. So I was ready for him to be more demanding in those directions. And then, or he'd say, okay, play Debussy, meaning improvise, and I want it to sound like Debussy, or play Mozart, or play Bach. And that was wonderful. So it was a very kind of old-fashioned, in the best sense of the word, musical foundational grounding that he gave me that I'll always treasure. I was particularly lucky to get to work with him right before he retired. He was a great teacher of conducting throughout his career at Oberlin, where he taught for many, many years. Yeah. But he was also one of the founding conductors of the Santa Fe Opera.
Oh, okay.
When John Crosby created the Santa Fe Opera, Boston was one of the first conductors he brought along. And I was lucky to have seen him a few years before he died. I was able to visit him in Santa Fe. And I felt very lucky to see him before he died. He was already starting to fade. He was in his 90s and starting to fade a bit mentally. And so I felt so lucky to get to see him before, he was still there 2 out of the 10 minutes of each 10-minute increment.
Yeah.
And that was great to connect with him at that point.
So it sounds, if I take it to, these are 2 names I've mentioned often on the podcast. If you were a Knussen student, everything was based on technique. Whereas if you were a Hans Swarovski student in Vienna, all of those guys have said that they basically got 10 minutes of technique, period. In your particular case, you can also add in a third school, which is the German Kapellmeister system, where everything is based on the piano. So it sounds like you were very much more of a sort of Swarovski Kapellmeister sort of schooling than, say, the many conductors I've talked to on here who've been taught by Knussen. So where do you think you got your technique from, or did it just evolve over the many years of study that you had?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess what happened was I got that foundational schooling, don't do that, fix that. Don't go outside that box. I got those. And also, what are the levers here, and the Newtonian approach to how to manage the stick. And so I had a pretty rigorous grounding at that mechanical level, but then I was Seiji Ozawa's assistant.
Yes. Yeah.
So all that went flying right out the window. I mean, he was like a force of nature. Where did that technique come from? In a sense, right, he was a Saito student. But then on the other hand, he took those particular principles and flew with them, having worked with Karajan and Bernstein. And so his technique was this fascinating amalgamation of influences and certainly idiosyncratic to him. But while I was working with him, of course, I mean, how did we all learn? We steal.
Yes.
So while I was working with him, I was trying all kinds of things on for size for myself. Right. And I think eventually the things that I was able to steal got incorporated into me in a way that I don't think I resemble him in any particular way, but the things that got digested, I think are there too. So it's that myriad. And then everyone else I've observed, and I remember working at the BSO, one of the great privileges was to witness the guest conductors who came through. So to have the opportunity to, especially Haitink for me was a kind of revered model.
Yes.
If you can do that, then you're a conductor. Yeah. So those influences were just as big. So I think that in addition to that, schooling was, Max used to say, the best way to learn to conduct is to conduct.
Yes. Yeah.
The next best way is to observe, and the next best way is to have a teacher. And I feel like I got all three. I noticed with my students at Aspen, when they're observing a rehearsal, I get so annoyed when their heads are in the score. And can't you do that at home? Because I remember when I was Seiji's assistant, if I was observing a rehearsal, I was observing the rehearsal. I wanted to see what was going on. What was the interaction musically, psychologically, socially, technically, all those, what the incredible complexity of the relationship between a conductor and orchestra, to kind of be able to sit there and try and observe and record that. Just there's so much subtle information there. You can't get it all. How can you possibly be looking at the score while you're trying to take in all of that?
I agree so much. I mean, my background is 22 years of playing. As I said to you before I pressed record, I remember playing for you very well. But I would assist Sakura Ormo and assist Andrus Nelsons when they did the concert performances of opera. I wanted to see what they were doing. I wanted to see how they were working with the singers. I wanted to see all of this. And then going back to what you said about people rubbing off on you, there are times now I conduct and think, well, that was a rattle beat. And then other times I conduct and go, well, that was a brilliant Ormo upbeat, but I don't mean it. It's just they rub off on you. They were the people, those were the two conductors I played for the most. And even little things, I did 7 years under Andrus Nelsons before I retired. There are little times I conduct things and think, oh, that was very Andrusy. Don't do that, And to rub off on you, isn't it? It just does. It's if you're friends with somebody for a long time, you share vocabulary in your sentences, you share jokes, you share common word use, and it's exactly the same if you're assisting. So it's not a surprise at all.
Right.
We jumped over you. After finishing your studies, you becoming director of all orchestral activities at Bowling Green State University, and then going back to Oberlin to lead the opera program. So I'm imagining during this, I'm guessing 5-year period before you go to Boston with Ozawa, you're conducting every day, pretty much. You've got students there on tap. It must have been just, as you've just said, Max Rudolph said the best way of learning to conduct is to conduct. That must have been a great 5 years of just learning rep. Every day.
It was so fantastic for me. And maybe the most important part was the operas, because that started at Bowling Green, despite the fact that I was specifically hired at Oberlin to do the operas. A big part of my job at Bowling Green was the opera productions as well. And those were the first operas I was conducting. So it was a gift. And the other part of that gift that was spectacular was the director I was doing them with.
Right.
Who was actually quite a giant. His name was Roy Lazarus, and he had quite a career as a singer, both in opera and on Broadway. So, and that's another Santa Fe connection, because Stravinsky was one of his fans. That's not bad.
No, that's not bad at all.
As a singer, if you get that. And he was the first one to sing "Standing on the Corner, Watching All the Girls Go By," and what was that? "The Most Happy Fellow," I think, on Broadway. And so a wide-ranging career. But he'd also done television. He'd been on the Ed Sullivan Show. He'd been on I Love Lucy. I mean, he'd been around. And he ran, I think the only professional company he ran was Kansas City, but he had also taught opera programs at Juilliard, IU, and Oberlin as well. And for any number of personal reasons, late in life, he had retired, but came out of retirement to teach at Bowling Green. Yeah. So here's this school, state school in Ohio that happens to have a very good college of music, but it's not a school that one would think of as in the way that you put the great music schools in America on a pedestal. That's not one of them. But in fact, wonderful things have come out of it. I met Jennifer Higdon there, who later in life, I had such a close relationship with her as a composer. She was in my conducting seminar as a flute major at Bowling Green University. And meanwhile, I'm getting to do all my first operas with this real theater mensch. Yeah. I mean, he knew the ins and outs of theater in a way that I'm eternally grateful to him, just working with him. And he had the most, so here I am 5 years old, and he's 65 years old. And he had the most wonderful way of not treating me like his student. Yeah. And yet, really treating me like a colleague, and we became very close friends, and still managing to teach me everything I needed to learn, which was a hell of a lot. And it was just that was a gift from how does anyone get that lucky? Yeah. So I'm doing my first Figaro, my first Giovanni, my first Suor Angelica, it was fantastic. Yeah. And he just had us. His theatrical sensibilities, it was a sixth sense. I'll never forget, we were doing auditions for some show, and a soprano came in, and when she finished singing, he said, "So when are you expecting?" Wow. Said, "Well, I'm not pregnant." And he said, "No, you are." Wow. You may not have figured it out, but I'm telling you, you are. You need to go see a doctor. He was right.
Wow.
I mean, I don't know how anyone has that kind of magical sixth sense, but he had it. Yeah. So he could sniff out what was going on stage in the most wonderful ways, the subtlety of a dramatic situation, or the efficacy of someone's acting. So he really sensitized me to the singing actor, to the singing actress, that when that combination happens in a performer, it's so electrifying, and he knew how to teach it.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. What a wonderful story. It reminds me of a friend of ours. We knew that we were going to have our second child, but nobody else did. And she apparently knew by the way my wife was walking that she thought that we were pregnant for the second time.
Oh my God.
We both poo-pooed it, but she's absolutely adamant. She said, I knew all along. Just, okay,
Isn't
fair
that
enough.
Uncanny?
It is very weird, but wow, I'd love to know how Roy knew that. I mean, that must have been something in that he'd heard in her voice, or how she was supporting or not supporting the sound. But
yeah.
Fascinating.
Amazing.
So
he also had a wicked sense of humor.
Oh, right, okay.
And that kept us, we laughed our way through those 4 years pretty healthily too.
Yeah. It helps. And actually, people you share humor with, I think, are often your favorite teachers, because, if they can't get at you in a non-humorous way, they'll teach you in a humorous way. And,
right.
Yeah, I think that works. So when 1990 came around and you went to become assistant to Boston Symphony Orchestra with Seiji Ozawa, did you stop at Oberlin and Bowling Green and just become an assistant, or did they run concurrently at all?
I stayed on. I became, I think, officially half-time as a professor at Oberlin. Oh. In Boston, there were two of us. You might know Grant Llewellyn.
Yes. Yeah.
Grant and I were partners in crime in Boston for 3 years. And it was a wonderful setup, because that way we could spell each other. So I would go back to Oberlin and do 2 opera productions a season. And that was pretty much all I was doing at Oberlin at that time. But I did that the whole time I was in Boston. And Grant would be covering while I was in Oberlin, and then Grant would go off and do other things when I went back to Boston. And sometimes we were there together, and that wasn't maybe the best thing for the institution, because we had a lot of fun together. And so I continued, and actually I'm still on faculty at Oberlin. I've never given up my tenure.
Oh, wow.
I don't go back very often. I'll be there next year. I was there 2 years ago. Every year I'm not there. I'm on leave of absence. They're not paying me, so I don't feel guilty. Yeah. And then when I show up, I do what I can. I'm still very emotionally attached to the school, and really love going back and working with the students. So whenever I can arrange it, I do it. And I haven't left my professorship there ever. I had already left when I went to Oberlin. After 4 years at Bowling Green, I left Bowling Green entirely. So that 1 year at Oberlin before I went to Boston, I was a full-time professor there.
Well, we're going to come to teaching later, because I want to pick your brains. And your name has come up as being somebody who's been a teacher of some of the previous people on the podcast. But about 3 years after you finish at Boston, you become music director of the Brooklyn Philharmonic, and then principal guest. But then the big thing, in 2001, you become music director of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. And I want to pick your brains about being a US music director and all that entails. It's come up before on the podcast, but you spent 20 years there. I'm assuming you're coming to an end, or just about to come to an end.
I just conducted, this COVID season.
Yeah.
We didn't have live concerts, but we were one of the lucky ones. We did we worked almost every week, as we would have, with reduced numbers and distancing and plastic and God knows. No audience. Right. But recording these things and releasing them online. Digital season. Yeah. And so I just did but I end up calling them concerts, because we were recording programs. Yeah. But the last week I did, things had changed enough. We were able to do a Mahler 4 with a full orchestra.
Wow.
And that was just after this year. I mean, to have 75 people on the stage was without plastic interfering, and maybe a little excess distance, but it was almost normal, and it just felt absolutely wonderful. And that was my final week as music director of the ASO. So I am officially not music director of the ASO anymore.
Well, I'm going to ask the question in a minute, but I'm going to dwell briefly on the fact that last week I conducted the CBSO in one of we're now allowing a quarter or a third audiences back in.
Oh, great.
But when I did Malcolm Arnold's Fifth Symphony with the full orchestra, almost a full string section, and to finish and get applause, you just forget how deep.
Were you in heaven?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely in heaven.
That's what happens to me when it's normal again.
You just forget, or we have forgotten, or how deeply moving it is, and especially the end of that symphony, it basically rips your heart out of your chest. You just stand there and think, oh, applause, it's wonderful. So wonderful for you.
That familiar sound.
Yeah.
That beautiful sound.
My question to do with Atlanta is, and I've written it down because it's. I think I read somewhere that you've got ticket sales to go up, but obviously there's the philanthropy, there's meeting donators, there's meeting all of that, doing all of that sort of stuff. The question I've written down is, what does it take to make a job a success as music director in the United States? Somebody's done it for 20 years and it's been a success at Atlanta. What do you think the conductor's role and thought process has to be to make that a success?
Oh boy, that's a tough. I mean, your list was great. The things you were saying that to set up your question, are all part of that mix for sure. I mean, that the things you were mentioning, that's all spot on in my mind. Yeah. But I guess I kind of, in my own mind, distill everything down to, I think it all comes from just a recognition and an acceptance that one's role is as the face of the orchestra in the community. You have to become an ambassador for that orchestra in that place. And it has to do with a political, I don't mean in terms of politics per se, but political in its most fundamental sense, the polis, that you participate in the life of the city. And I think that's true anywhere, anytime, up to a point. But in America, because of the way we're funded, because of the way we interface with where we live, it's all the more incumbent on any music director to take that political or social or civic role very seriously. And you get used to seeing your face on the bus. You know, if things are going well, you will see your face painted on the side of the bus as it goes by. Yeah. And you have to get used to knowing that if you're out and about, you should and will be recognized, and you need to assume that role. And that leads to everything else, I think. I think all the other things can fit under that assumption of responsibility. And that's the fun, as you were mentioning, that's the fundraising, that's the spreading the word, and getting ticket sales. And for me, it was, I participated in every aspect of the institution, at least in an advisory or attentive way, and hopefully not getting in people's way, but helping them in what they were trying to do. We had a wonderful way of working when I came to the ASO, which was very, I don't know if people are still using it. At the time, people referred to institutions running in a siloed way, so that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. We were the opposite of that, and we had these wonderful meetings. We used to call them the war room meetings, and it was inspired by that place in the Dr. Strangelove, the Kubrick movie, where Peter Sellers, as the president, says, "Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room." Yeah, and we did fight, and in a most wonderful way. You know, we and I found it to be so valuable, because when you start putting on the table the multiple agendas that have to be satisfied for the institution to succeed, you realize that that's a focus for creativity, not a wet blanket on creativity. Quite the opposite. So when you're taking your marketing director seriously, and he has the audacity to say to you, "Well, I can't sell Brahms," then you have to take him seriously, and you have to figure out, well, how are we going to sell Brahms? Because you have to, otherwise, who are we?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so it's, but that effort to satisfy multiple agendas, I found so satisfying in that interface with with the development director, education director, marketing director. Though that to me was part of the great excitement about running this orchestra. Yeah. And not every orchestra very few orchestras function with so much interactivity between its departments, or certainly with its music director. And it is common for a music director to create a season, and then the marketing director to try and figure out how to sell it. I found that because of the way we were working, by the time we knew what our plans were, everybody knew why we were doing it, how we were going to do it, how we were going to get there. So there was a fundamentally shared common purpose when we came to executing our plans. And that was powerful. And I think that we did something very right in that way as an institution.
It sounds like you did. I mean, I'm sitting here nodding away, thinking, "Well, I'd want to be involved in meetings like that." And I'm going to put a sort of parallel track and think about how it's done in the UK. About the fact that, I don't know what the percentage is, but obviously they get central government funding to a larger or lesser degree. Some cases none, in some cases much more than others. But which means that there is less need for the conductor to be involved in ticketing and PR, and so it's sort of, I would just anecdotally know that with some orchestras it's encouraged that the music director gets involved, in others it's encouraged that they don't, and if you take that to the face on the bus, there are some cities, I'm going to say Liverpool, where I know that that Petrenko has been on the side of a bus,
Yeah.
But I don't think I've ever seen the music director of the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, and that included when it was Simon Rattle, who was possibly the most famous conductor in the UK, Europe at the time. I don't remember seeing him on the side of a bus. And I'm wondering whether, if they had been on the side of the bus, people would have gone, well, who's that? I'm going to find out who it is and what are they doing on the side of a bus. Oh, there's a concert hall there, and that sort of chain of events. And so there are parts of a lot of what you said I'd love to happen over here in the UK, and I know that if I ever got the chance to be involved with a US orchestra, sign me on. I'm ready to come to all sorts of meetings and be part of that corporate city civic feeling. I think in Birmingham we have it because we're the only orchestra in the city really, and same in Liverpool. We have that corporate sense of things. But it sounds like the perfect way to run things, really. Are you looking forward to doing it again in Fort Worth?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
I have already been having wonderful meetings with not only staff there, but with it's going to take me a while to get started. I'm really not there until fall of 22. So in the meantime, I'm trying to get as much information and get as much a handle on what's going on institutionally as I can. I just finished up having meetings of 8 to 10 at a time of all the players of the orchestra, just to hear from them what's going on, what's important, what do we need, what's valuable, what isn't, what needs to be gotten rid of, and so on. And I did that when I came to Atlanta as well, and that's proven very valuable already in Fort Worth.
That's brilliant. I so wish that had happened when I was a player. Though I'd have been frightened to death sitting in a room with 7 other musicians of Simon Rattle. I'd have crapped myself and probably never said a word. But anyway, that was a 22-year-old me. Now,
well, I'm not as intimidating as Simon.
At this point, I asked Bob Spano about his teaching role at Aspen, if he has a particular approach to teaching, and what he sees his role as being at that particular point of a conductor's career. We also discuss the 2 different types of conducting technique he usually sees, and how he decides on which conductors get chosen for Aspen. His search for talent leads him to tell another funny anecdote about Roy Lazarus. If you want to hear that 10-minute discussion, I've turned it into a Patreon-exclusive bonus mini-episode. For as little as £5 a month, you get access to this mini-episode, as well as all the previous other mini-episodes. You'll also get a monthly bulletin podcast from me about my career, as well as advanced news about this podcast. You also get an interview once a month with a prominent person from the classical music world who has dealings with conductors, as well as articles, essays, and all sorts of other conducting-based content. The details of how to join are in the show notes below, and I'd love to see you subscribe to this supporters club of A Mic on the Podium very soon. Now, back to my chat with Robert Spano. I've got one other question before we do the 10 questions, Robert, which is, every conductor's answered this, and it's really one for me and for the conducting geeks and the students. When you come to learn a new score, do you have a process? Do you still use a piano? I know you're still composing, so maybe you're using your inner ear. And when in the process of learning it, are you a marker-upper? Are you somebody who scribbles in? Are you a blue, red, and black? Or do you even use highlighter pens? Or are you one of these geniuses, I think, who write little or nothing into their score? What's your process and what goes on the paper?
Well, I used to be a genius.
Right. Yeah.
And I've lost that. I remember we were doing, Oliver Knussen was one of my closest friends.
Lovely man, lovely man, yeah.
It's just so hard to know that I can't believe he's not in the world. It just doesn't register as the truth to me yet.
No.
But Ollie and Reinbert de Leeuw and I were doing Gruppen in Tanglewood. And that was in and of itself just...
I bet, yeah.
Oh, and with those 2, I mean, that was exhilarating to work. We had to rehearse together, just the 3 of us. I don't know how many hours we spent together. Usually, but it was fun rehearsing the 3 of us because it usually involved wine and metronome arguments. Right, well, that might be 72.5 on your metronome. But on mine, I'll tell you, it's a damn different thing. Yeah. But it was so exhilarating. And what made me think of it is we decided Ollie was the best conductor because he had 6 colors.
Ah, yes.
And Reinbert had red and blue.
Yeah.
And at that time, I only had pencil.
Yeah. I've seen one of Ollie's scores when.
Oh my God!
When they were. It was beautifully marked up. It was the Miraculous Mandarin. I think we just did the suite, and he was using a miniature score as well, which just blew my mind. How can you? Well, I suppose it means you have to learn it, but I actually quietly flicked through his score, and it was a thing of beauty. As somebody who loves marking up scores, I mean, it really was a thing of beauty.
Yeah.
So
somehow after, I mean, Max was very, he poo-pooed overly marking scores. So that was in my training at that time. But then working with Seiji, so there was that experience with Reinbert and Ollie, and seeing how they marked and why and what it served for them. And then I was seeing Ozawa's scores because he marked extensively. I mean, he used all kinds of stuff. Nothing like, it was the exact opposite of Knussen's markings, which were so fastidious and clean. I mean, you could learn the score from his markings alone, right?
Yeah.
Seiji's were big scrawls and colors. It was like a coloring book in there. And I asked Seiji once, because people thought he had a photographic memory, and I just wasn't sure. So I finally asked him, after I'd worked with him long enough, I wasn't too intimidated to ask. And he said, "Oh, no, I do not." And then I realized, oh, yeah, he never knows the rehearsal numbers. He doesn't know what page he's in. It's not like Mazel, where, he knows everything from what's on the page.
Yeah.
Seiji, and he said, "I study." He said, "I get up at 5 every morning and I study." And so his memorization was a process. But then seeing that how he was using pencil. And then when I left the BSO, I was itinerant completely. I had 1 year where I didn't have a residence. I lived in hotels. And that was a tough 3 years, but it was wonderful. I mean, I was traveling everywhere. I was conducting, but I had to learn so much repertoire fast. And what I found was that the marking became a way of digesting, of putting it in my system, that maybe those markings didn't mean so much to me after I'd done them, but they meant a lot to me for the process of doing them, how I was then assimilating the material. And from there, over, I don't know, about 15, 20 years, I kept refining the way I mark, and I kept changing things, and I kept getting closer and closer to something that just made sense to me. And I've always, from the time I worked with Boston and Oberlin, done a kind of phrase architectural analysis as a kind of entryway into any score I do. And I've never stopped doing that, but I found ways of marking it that are increasingly sophisticated, but also personal. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone necessarily. But for me, even finding ways of marking the meters, I've adjusted over time. What's the most clear, concise, effective way of marking things became an obsession almost. Now I have a very particular way of marking that hasn't changed much in maybe 5-10 years. And it serves me very well. And what I find is that I feel like what's evolved for me is valuable because I can apply it to anything and it helps me. So it's not just something that helps me with Haydn. It's going to help me with Osvaldo Golijov too. So that means to me something about what I'm doing is inherently valuable for my process. And that's how I look at it. And with my students at Aspen, I encourage them, you figure out what works for you. If it works for you not to mark, don't mark. If it works, but the one thing I recommend is if you're going to mark, don't be shy.
I agree with that. I mean, I offer advice to my students about, this is the system I use, and I've used it now for 10 years. And I've found, as you said, it's transferable from Baroque to, the ink's still wet on the page. But please use your own. Please don't do anything if you feel that you can do it another way. I'm just offering you what I do, but I'm not making it a rule or a mantra or a
absolutely.
law.
Absolutely. Isn't that it though?
Yeah, because absolutely. Yeah.
Everybody has to do the work that we do with our particular markings one way or the other.
Yeah. But the point is you've got to do the work,
You've got to do the work.
And like you, I agree that I often, when I turn a page, I know what's written on the other page because I remember writing it in, which means that I've learnt the piece. That works for me. It's
well, and now that I'm blind, all I can see is my markings anyway. So I really, and I use it very consistently. And you asked me about the piano, and I still use the piano a great deal.
Yeah.
I can't brag to myself that I'm so good as to hear off the page every time accurately. I can certain pieces, certain languages, certain tonal languages, but boy, I get a new score from somebody who's exploring harmonies that are unique to them. I confess I need the piano. I'm not going to get there no matter how long I stare at that page without the help. I need the crutch. And frankly, I love the crutch. And even now, what I find valuable for me, because of my relationship to the keyboard and because I'm so accustomed to playing scores at the piano, if I'm coming back to a piece I've done 100 times, one of the best ways I know to re-engage it is to play it for myself. So I'll go back to the piano to play Beethoven 7 whenever I'm about to conduct Beethoven 7, because I end up looking at everything with a new eye, because I'm trying to play everything, and I'll make different choices about how I reduce things, and I'll keep working on my own transcription, so to say. And that, I don't know, refreshes my relationship to the score. And so I even use the piano in that way. I tend to use recordings as well in the way that we were all taught not to.
Yes.
Because I find them incredibly useful. And I remember somebody asked Esa-Pekka about Salonen about using recordings, and he said, well, it's another resource. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought, now that's terrific.
Yeah, Paavo Järvi has said the same thing on a film for the Berlin Philharmonic. He said you'd be an absolute lunatic not to listen to great recordings of the past or one that came out last week. They're all resources, especially now. I mean, I grew up, if I wanted to listen to a piece, I had to go to my local library, take out the LP, get the score. Now you can get it on your phone. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah. Well, the only thing that's important to be said about that is, you don't listen to them to copy it, but you're listening to, to be informed by it. Or somebody might do something, you go, why have they done that interpretation there? And then it gets you thinking about it. And that,
exactly.
You'd be stupid not to think about it.
Exactly. And I guess I understand the injunction from my training.
Yeah.
Because you should learn to play score at the piano. You should learn to solfege. You should do your best to hear from your visual information from the score transferring to your inner ear. Great. Then you should listen to a recording and see how they did it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I often find that my interpretive choices are informed by reacting. Oh, I would never do that.
Yeah.
That's horrible. I'm not going to do that. or the opposite. Oh, I never would have thought of that. Isn't that brilliant and insightful?
Yeah.
So I find them to be incredibly valuable. And I tend to listen to things, I tend not to listen to recordings much on things that I've done a lot at this point, I guess, just because I don't feel the need in any particular way, except on occasion.
Yeah.
But if I'm learning something new, I tend to want to go through 10 recordings at some point and see how other people have looked at the same material as I have.
I think the interesting comment that Simon Rattle made on the same film is about listening to recordings. He said, I do exactly the same, but I don't listen to it too early and I don't listen to it too late. Just before.
That's it.
Yeah, somewhere in the middle where I've already looked at the score, I've already found the phrasing, I've already done some preliminary work, either at the piano or whatever else. But I also don't want to be doing it in the week beforehand when you're really forming your final thoughts.
How perfect is that? Yeah.
Bob, it's 10 questions time, and I always start with the same two, which are, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
I love the sound of the piano.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a real piano lover.
Yeah.
And as I've started composing again in earnest, because for, 10, 15 years, I did very little.
Yeah.
And coming back to it in the last 8 or so, I'm in love with the sound of the piano all over again, and been writing a lot for the piano.
Yeah.
Because the resonance of the piano and I don't know, it's something you can bathe in. I hate the sound of leaf blowers. And I would like to outlaw them.
Yeah.
And I would like to have a violent rampage against those using them.
Well, what you can't hear because I've got my window shut, which means I'm absolutely sweating in my upstairs room of my house.
No.
But somebody has got some garden machinery out next door.
No.
It's not a leaf blower. It's not autumn, so it can't be a leaf blower. But something.
Well, that's what I keep thinking around here. It's not autumn. How can it be these leaf blowers?
Yeah, I know. But I agree with you, especially if it's one of those in the UK rare days when you can sit out in your garden and you think, oh, it's just nice and quiet. And then somebody thinks, yeah, I'm going out in my garden and I'm going to get the machinery out. Yeah, thanks. Indeed.
That takes care of that day.
Yeah, indeed. If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
I am a biblioholic.
Ah.
And my mother is an excellent seamstress and quilter, and even made me pillows that define biblioholism.
Right.
As someone who has an unquenchable longing to purchase, peruse, read, shelf, alphabetize, and so on books.
Yeah.
And it is a passion of mine that I have had my whole life, and I not only love accumulating them and collecting them and have a fascination with rare editions and old editions and so on, but I also love reading them.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to blank on the author, but there was a essayist basically who's written beautifully on libraries and books. And one of the things he said was a great library is a form of telepathy. And I do feel sometimes if I'm in my library at my desk, and I just left my previous house, and in that house I had a 2-bedroom setup that was separated by a bathroom. So it was what they would call a Jack and Jill setup for kids.
Yeah.
Each have their own bedroom and share a bathroom. Well, I had both bedrooms full of books, and one of them was really my desk and my electric piano, my study.
Yeah.
And then the other one was just books and multiple shelves within the middle of the room too. So you really feel like you're in the stacks.
Yeah.
So if I'm allowed to spend a day at that desk,
you can spend it anywhere you like. It sounds great to me.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And for me, one book leads to another, and then I want to cross-reference this, and then I want to check that footnote out in that source, and then I start pulling things off. Eventually, I have stacks of things around me, and I'm in heaven. And then I get to refile them, which is equally exciting. Keeping things, alphabetized and in order is also part of the joy of a library. It may not look ordered to others, but I know where every book is.
Yeah. I'm like that with as most of us on Zoom are sitting in some location or other. I'm in my study, and behind me are my scores, as Robert can see. And I'm like that with I'm doing a rehearsal on Wednesday in London, and I know before COVID I would have walked past a secondhand bookshop, and downstairs in the basement were scores. And I would always go in there. And the amount of times I've looked at my watch and thought, oh, God, I've got a rehearsal in 3 minutes. I better get out of here. And I'm going to pay for another 8 scores, which I may or may not have needed. But yeah, the time I could spend in a shop like that, and then get back here and make sure that they go back on the shelf in exactly the right place.
I have to admit, when we started, my eyes immediately gravitated to your shelves, and I wanted to go through what's on them.
Maybe this will stay on the podcast or not. But the biggest one that I'm hiding, see if I can move in the right direction. If I did that, can you see the big red and blue? You probably know what that is.
Is that Bach?
No, it's every note Richard Strauss ever wrote.
Oh, those are the Strauss scores. Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's the 30 volumes. I was gifted them by a friend from a recently deceased uncle they'd had who was a score collector. And this friend said to me, I've got these scores of Strauss. And I said, well, how many have you got? She said, I've got 30 volumes. Do you want them? I've got nowhere to keep them. I was like, oh, do I want them? Yeah, wow.
Yes.
Yeah. The difficult day came when I ended up for the first time using one. and thinking, well, do I write in these or not? And I actually messaged her on Facebook, and she said he would be so pleased if you wrote on it. But that first red marking of 4 and a bar over the top was, I'm defiling these things, but yeah, I'm going to try and defile more of them as we go along.
Exactly.
Question number 4. You can have more than one, as many as you like. Who would be a favourite conductor or conductors of yesteryear?
One of the people I think of, who of course I can only admire in my imagination, is Nickish.
Yes.
Because in a sense, he's the father of us all, having had no career as anything else.
Yeah. There's one, isn't there one clip with no music that you can see of him conducting?
Yeah.
There's no soundtrack to it. It's just a silent clip of him.
Yeah, exactly. But the fact that his musical reputation was built with his baton and not as a composer or violinist or pianist or anything else, I think is, I don't know, somehow he feels like the father of conducting in the modern sense. And although any conductor should be fluent in any number of other musical disciplines, nevertheless, he's a career conductor. It was drummed into me to admire Toscanini, so I do. And and the other one that leaps to my mind because of his reputation as a humanist is Metropolis.
Not a name I'm sure who's come up on here before. I know he was a big influence on Leonard Bernstein at the very start of his career. Died tragically young, didn't he? Wasn't he actually conducting when he died, I think?
I don't know that. That's very possible.
I think he may be true. I might need to fact check myself before I put it out on the podcast. But a real lion of a conductor who was taken very early, wasn't he? Well, let's see what your choices are for question 5, because I love your choices for question 4. So question 5 is, who would be a favorite current conductor or conductors?
Well, you're reminding me of a scene in the Golden Girls television show where Rose is dating a professor. So she's feeling, and Rose is the dim-witted one. And so she's feeling particularly intimidated, and she's at a party, and she overhears someone saying, well, if you can invite any 2 people, living or dead, to dinner, who would they be? And now she's trying to repeat this question in another setting to make conversation. And it comes out, if you could invite any 2 people, living or dead, to dinner, what would you serve? Which, in a way, is quite brilliant.
Yes.
So I guess it depends what's being served.
Of course. Yeah. Well, but people have definitely given their answers led on the choice of repertoire. Absolutely, in the past. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not alone in this.
No, not in the slightest. No.
Okay, so that's good to know. But without saying what repertoire, for me, I could say Esa-Pekka Salonen is someone I deeply admire, and so is Seiji Ozawa, obviously, having worked with him. And Michael Tilson Thomas is another American to whom I look at. He's enough older than me that I look to him as a model of the beautiful things he's done in Miami and San Francisco. And so I'll name those 3.
What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
Well, I can give 2 answers, right?
Yes, you can, yes.
Okay, so the hardest in terms of carving, stupid human tricks, would have to be Gruppen of Stockhausen.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it just is a real bear to be on top of the mechanics of the score and to be able to do it with one's colleagues. And the other one I would mention is The Ring.
Okay.
Because when I did The Ring, that was my first Wagner conducting other than orchestral excerpts in my life.
Wow.
I was never a big Wagnerite, quite the contrary. Ollie and I would make fun of Wagner on a regular basis. And one time I was visiting him, and I saw, and it was opportune because I had been asked if I would do The Ring in Seattle, and I hadn't given an answer. I didn't know how I felt about this.
Mm.
And I arrive at his place, and there's Wagner stacked everywhere. Not just the scores and the CDs, but the prose. This is making me a little nervous. I said, what's going on here? And he said, oh, I'm trying to write longer music.
Brilliant.
So I told him I have this chance to do the Ring.
Yeah.
And he said, well, tell you what, I'll put Act 1 of Siegfried on, and if you can get through that, you'll be fine.
Mm.
So he did. He put the headphones on. He went off doing whatever. Midway through scene 2, I start screaming, turn it off, make it stop. was not, it wasn't my cup of tea by any means. And I'd read too much Nietzsche to really, fall into the cult. But I spent about 9 months. Spate Jenkins, who's a fantastic impresario, I mean, he did just amazing things at the Seattle Opera throughout his career. But he had enough faith in me that he thought I could do this. And he knew that he was asking me to do something way out of my sphere of interest, let alone capability. Totally untested waters for me. And in the course of those 9 months, I did start to get glimmers of why everyone's so Wagner obsessed. And then I really carved out my schedule. So he had asked me about 5 years in advance. So for 2 years, I started studying very carefully on my own. And then the 2 years prior to doing the Ring, I stopped guest conducting essentially. I did maybe 3 gigs a year in addition to taking care of Atlanta. And the rest of the time I'm studying the Ring. And what a fantastic opportunity that was. I mean, I would say to anyone who's asked to conduct the Ring, say yes. Because who gets to do it, number one?
Well, exactly,
How rare the opportunities are. And for an idiot like me, who had to get to be so old to learn, what an education. What a genius this man is. And how badly I misunderstood him. And as a composer, I believed what I was taught in school, and it's not true. He wasn't just a prophet. He was also an encyclopedist. He was a Janus-faced giant who encapsulates the past and propels it into the future. It's unbelievable. Or you think, if you're not a Wagnerian, you think, well, can't they make cuts? And then if you study Wagner, you realize you cut one note and you're doing as much damage as you'd be doing to a Mozart symphony.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is impeccably crafted, and according to its own criterion. And you have to respect that. Well, I do. And the searing beauty of that music is one thing, but the gigantic intellect behind it is quite another. And we can make fun of his librettos as much as we want, but they are perfectly crafted for the stage. And we all know that the best play doesn't necessarily make the best libretto, and often what is not necessarily a very good play as a libretto is great for making an opera. And he understood that somehow. He understood everything in ways that are just unimaginable, except how to behave. And at some point I had to realize I don't have to approve of him humanly. I don't think I'd want to have lunch with Beethoven. But I had to overcome that bias, that prejudice of mine to engage him deeply. And what a gift. What a gigantic gift he is to the world of music. And it's just unbelievable to me how badly I misunderstood him all my life. The things I hated most in his operas became my favorite things. The Norns. Why do we have to hear this story again? Haven't we all been here? And it's night 4. Can we get on with it? No, that's not it at all. He's not retelling the story. He's turning that kaleidoscope of understanding. It's a Nietzschean process of perspectivism. It's giving us this whole other way of looking at the same material and highlighting it and expanding it and refracting it. And or Wotan's monologue in the middle of Valkyrie, endless monologue that many people are not fond of. That became for me, that's like the heart of the Ring, because I started perceiving the Ring for myself. I became one of the people who see it through the prism of Wotan's perspective, even though his participation in the last opera isn't, you can say that, well, how can it be about Wotan? But for me, it still is. The unfolding of the entire event is from, and psychologically, I think that's a viable way to view it as well. Anyway, I'm babbling on and on and on because it was one of the greatest experiences of my life.
So what's amazing is that, the question 6 was, what's the hardest work you've ever conducted? And it's ended up with you basically saying it was one of the greatest things you've ever did. But, but that's partly what we do, isn't it? Sometimes you open a score and go, what on earth am I going to do with this? I've conducted scores that it looks like a row of data or endless telephone numbers. Every bar's a different time signature or whatever.
Right.
Oh, this is so hard. But by the end of it, you're convinced. You've 180-degree shift. It's a fascinating thing about that question is that I rarely get the same answer. And I always get different reasons as to why people have found it hard. But what a great story. Absolutely wonderful.
I think what was hard for me about it was having to immerse myself in it after a lifetime of neglect in just a few years.
Yeah.
And with that much music, a few years isn't very long.
No. Number 7. Which the question is, before I read it out for you, when traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without? You're not allowed to say passport, baton, cell phone, score, or suitcase, because all of those answers are banned. But I suspect I know what your answer is going to be anyway, because you gave it about books anyway. But it might not be. You might need a yoga mat or something. But I'll read the question out for you. I'll read the question out.
I might could use a yoga mat, but I don't take one.
No. I'll cut in so I can read it out. When traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Well, you told me that you could predict my answer, but it's true. I have to have my reading material with me, and a Kindle won't do.
No,
I've not been able to adjust. I just can't do it. And so I always take something. I take a few things. I try and travel as light as I can manage to force myself regarding the books, but I need something I know and love, and is something I can reread with pleasure. And I need something new that's fascinating me. And then I need something else that I'll read if I don't want to read those two things. And then I need another thing, so eventually the luggage is getting heavier, and then I start putting things back and trying to pick, but I need my reading material on the road.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
The one thing I would change about being a conductor. That is tough.
Would you like some previous answers?
No, I want to wrestle with it a little.
Oh, okay, fine. Wrestle away.
That's a tough question.
I know. Sorry.
Well, why do we have to have that orchestra playing? Do you remember that? Do you remember Ormandy's famous line, "Why do you insist on playing while I'm trying to conduct?" I think I don't know if this is an answer, but it's what comes to mind. I would change everyone's mind that the conductor is not a musician.
That's a brilliant answer.
Because I know so often people talk about the conductor and the musicians. And I don't think of myself as separate from the orchestra. I don't think of myself as separate from the musicians. And I know I'm not making any sound, but I'm still in the mix. And I don't feel like the product is mine alone. I don't approach conducting as the orchestra needs to do what I want. I approach it as I'm the first violinist of a string quartet, and I need to take my leadership role responsibly, but I also need to invite the creativity of the people who are playing and actually making this sound. But I think that makes us musicians.
Absolutely.
And so often we are, and I don't mind the jokes. That's okay with me. And keep the jokes, the difference between a bull and a conductor and so on.
Yes.
That's all good. But the one about the snake, well, he has no ears and he's slimy. He must be a conductor. All of that stuff is fair game. Yeah. But really we're musicians. And it saddens me that it's so difficult to be regarded as such, even by ourselves. You know, we conductors, I think, sometimes get trapped in, well, I have to create this music for everyone. Well, yeah, you have to do your job. I mean, you have to be there. You have to know the score intimately. You have to have a clue. You have to lead us in a certain direction. But you'd better incorporate the creativity of your colleagues along the way. And I think we're musicians first.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Monk. But I can't find a cult that I'm willing to join.
Yeah. Very good. That answer's staying in.
Fire or otherwise.
That answer's staying in. If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Well, I'd like, but there's music involved, or just the meal and drink?
No, just the meal and drink. If you want music involved.
Oh, I thought it was the last thing you listened to as well.
No.
Oh, just eating and drinking?
Yeah, just eating and drinking. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Spaghetti and meatballs and wine.
Red, I'm assuming?
Red. But the meatballs and spaghetti have to be of my making.
Oh, cool.
Because this is the joke. I have my great-grandmother's recipe, but it's from my mother's side, and she was Finnish.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, it sounds like a wonderful meal, and having laughed and chuckled with you for the last hour or so, I hope I would be invited to share your spaghetti and meatballs.
You're more than welcome. You don't even have to bring the wine.
I would. But thank you, Robert. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This really was a pleasure. Thank you very, very, very much.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a Dutch conductor who, after entering the German Kapellmeister system, became music director in 2 German opera houses over a 13-year period. He guest conducts all over the world, has a teaching position at the Amsterdam Conservatoire, and, since recording the interview, he has been appointed Chief Conductor Designate of the Belgian National Orchestra, starting in 2022. But until then, bye-bye.